The baggage master lets his pistol fall to the rail bed, and the two men, as instructed, extend their arms as if ready to be manacled and walk forward. Meanwhile, up on the platform, a Negro man named Hayward Shepherd, a freedman employed at the station as the night baggage man, has stepped from the office to the platform to see what's going on. And Phelps, the conductor, too far from the bridge to see in the darkness that the engineer and the baggage master have been all but taken prisoner, orders him to go and assist them. Shepherd hurries to join the two, who have disappeared inside the bridge. When he too has neared the entrance and is beyond earshot of the men on the platform, he hears a calm, low voice from the darkness ordering him to stop and listen. In a conversational tone, Watson tells him what Father has instructed all of us to say to the Virginia freedmen. "We have come to free the slaves. You may join us in this enterprise or not. But if you refuse to join us, we will be forced to consider you our enemy." For a second, Shepherd hesitates, as if not quite getting Watson's meaning, and then abruptly turns and runs. Watson, or perhaps it is Taylor, or maybe some other raider, fires his rifle, and Shepherd falls, mortally wounded. No one daring to help, Shepherd slowly drags his numbed, dying body away from the bridge towards the station. After what seems like a long while, he succeeds in getting to a protected place below the platform that is close enough for Phelps and the hotel clerk to reach down and draw him up to it, where they quickly pull his body inside the station as if he were already a dead man. "Prepare yourselves for sad ironies," Father forewarned us, but it has come nonetheless as a dismaying shock. Men, the cruel perversity of slavery will snap back betimes and will try to bite us in our face, he told us. We have to be hard. This surely is what he meant, that in the liberation of the slaves, the first to die may well be neither a white man nor a slave, but a free Negro. For the time being, the town is still ours. A little after 4 a.m., Aaron Stevens' party comes clattering down Potomac Street, the trap driven by Tidd with Colonel Washington and Mr. Allstat and his son in it, and the farm wagon driven by Cook with the 7 liberated slaves huddled in back. As soon as they have arrived at the armory yard, Father tells the newly freed slaves who he is, Osawatomie Brown of Kansas, which, as he expected, evokes in them a certain fearfulness, until he reveals that his principal ally is the famous Negro Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave himself, and this seems to impress and calm them somewhat. He places pikes into their hands and stations them inside the firehouse to guard the hostages. "For now these white men are your prisoners," he says. "Treat them honestly, for they are hostages, and as we will be freeing them later, we want them to tell other white people the truth about us, that we want not revenge, but liberty." The 7 Negroes, a woman and 6 men, several of them barefoot in the cold night, take up their pikes and hesitantly, as if they have no choice in the matter, follow their former masters into the firehouse, while Father straps on George Washington's scabbard and sword, and the engraved pistol and tooled leather holster. In all his armament he is a formidable sight, a warrior chieftain, and with his Old Testament beard and fierce gray eyes and his battered straw hat and Yankee farmer's woolen frock coat and his peculiar way of speaking, he is a paradoxical one as well, a man out of time. It is close to 6 a.m. Before long, the first of the armory workers, all unsuspecting, come drifting into the center of town in 2s and 3s, and as they walk through the iron gate into the yard, Father and the others grab them and make them hostages in the firehouse, until he has close to 40 men crowded into the 2 large rooms and has to station several of his raiders inside with the freed slaves to help guard them. Then, by daylight, just as Father said it would, word of the raid gets out. Dr. John Starry, a local physician, is the first to raise the alarm. Summoned to the hotel hours earlier to care for the wounded watchman and the dying Hayward Shepherd by a courageous Negro barman who, at risk of his life, slipped out a side door and down dark alleyways to the physician's house, Dr. Starry bandages the watchman's forehead and is at Shepherd's side when the poor man dies, after which he succeeds in returning to his home undetected, where at once he rouses his family and neighbors. Soon the bell of the Lutheran church atop the hill starts to clang, summoning the citizens to an emergency meeting, and a rider has been sent to Shepherdstown to call out the local militia, and a second has been dispatched to Charlestown for the Jefferson Guards, formed for the express purpose of meeting precisely this circumstance after the Turner Rebellion back in '31. Father and his men, when they hear the church bell ringing on and on, know what is happening. "Don't be frightened, boys. Don't panic. There's still plenty of time," he assures the men. "The hostages and practically every rifle in the town are in our hands, and the Lord is watching over us." It is full daylight around 7 a.m. when Father strides through the gate of the armory yard and approaches the railroad station and calls out for the conductor. "Come here, sir. I wish to parley with you." Phelps pokes his head out of the door. "I have decided to let you move the train on to Baltimore," Father declares. "But tell your employer and all the civil and military authorities that this is the last train I will permit in or out of Harper's Ferry, at the extreme peril of those we have taken prisoner until we have finished with our business here." Phelps nods, and he and the engineer and the baggage master return to the train, fire it up, and take it slowly towards the covered bridge and across the Potomac into Maryland. From the schoolhouse on the heights opposite, I watch the train far below wind along the north bank of the river, and I know that as soon as the train has reached the station at Monocacy, news of the raid will reach the main offices of the B&O. An hour later, in Richmond, an aide to Governor Henry Wise will disturb the governor's breakfast with astonishing news, and shortly afterwards, in Washington, D.C., an adjutant general will burst into the office of the Secretary of War, who will read the wire from Governor Wise requesting federal troops, and will at once ask for an emergency meeting with President Buchanan. By evening, every newspaper in the land will be shouting the news of our raid. Fearful and exciting intelligence. Negro insurrection in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, led by John Brown of Kansas. Many slain, hundreds taken hostage, federal arms seized. It is mid-morning. The militias from Shepherdstown and Charlestown have not yet arrived, and in Washington, 50 miles to the east, federal troops are only now being mustered for railroad transport to Harper's Ferry. Over at the rifle works, Kagi has grown increasingly anxious, for he and his 2 men are the most vulnerable to attack. Kagi dispatches Leary to request Father to send back a wagon and additional men, so that they can quickly load the seized weapons from the factory and begin their escape into the mountains. It is time. None of the raiders has been killed or even wounded. According to the plan, they should all be departing from Harper's Ferry by now. And I, up on the Maryland Heights, should also have left by now. That is Father's plan, and everything up to now has gone accordingly, except for one thing. The hundreds of escaping slaves we expected to come rushing to our side have not yet appeared, and the few who have are turning fearful and hesitant, and may themselves have to be put under guard and made into hostages. But that does not matter, I decide. We have seized 3 wagon loads of weapons. We have terrorized the entire South into believing that an insurrection has begun, and in the north we have raised fresh huzzas and enthusiastic promises of material support and a coming flood of volunteer fighters. We have indeed begun an insurrection, which surely, thanks to the presence of Frederick Douglass, will catch and burst into flame in a matter of mere days. And if Father leads his men out of Harper's Ferry now and makes his appointed rendezvous with Mr. Douglass, we will still be able to feed those flames and follow them into the deeper South. It is not too late. The slaves will come in, Father insists. We must give them up to the last possible moment to learn of our raid and our intentions and to overcome their natural fears and flee their masters' farms and plantations for the town, which is still under our control. The second we abandon the town, the escaping slaves will have no place to go where they are not in terrible danger. For their sake we shall continue to hold the town, he declares, even as the Jefferson Guards ride in from the west and the Shepherdstown militia comes in from the north and the troop train from Washington slowly approaches from the east. One Saturday morning, a few weeks before the raid, Father came to me and said to come up to Chambersburg with him. I have arranged for a meeting there tomorrow morning with Mr. Douglass. Shortly, we are making our way in through the rolling pastures and the peaceful farm villages of western Maryland into Pennsylvania, arriving by evening at our Quaker safe house. By mid-morning, after much careful reconnoitering, we had taken up our position like watchful ravens at the quarry where Mr. Douglass finally found us. "Ah, Brown, here you are," Mr. Douglass exclaimed, much relieved. He smiled, and the two shook hands warmly and embraced. Mr. Douglass elaborately introduced his friend Shields Green, who he said was very interested in meeting the famous Osawatomie Brown and possibly in joining him down here in the fray. Then he greeted me with a smile and a handshake and gave Father to understand that he and Mr. Green needed to catch their breath for a moment or two. He leaned against the rock wall and fanned his dark, bearded face with his hat brim, while Shields Green sat and rested upon a table-sized stone nearby. Finally, Mr. Douglass said to Father, "All right, old John. Let me hear it. There are some wild rumors circulating up north about you and your boys, and I need to know the truth of the matter. I'll tell you, friend, some of your strongest supporters and allies are afraid that you're about to commence some wild, foolhardy action down here, and I'd like to go home and tell them otherwise. There's nothing wild or foolhardy about my plans except to men who lack courage and principles," Father began. And here he commenced the recitation with which I and the others had become so familiar that we could recite it word by word. He unrolled his maps and went over each step of the raid until he had got to our rendezvous in the wilderness with Frederick Douglass and the hundreds, perhaps thousands, of newly liberated slaves. Mr. Douglass was silent for a few moments and studied the maps with pursed lips and furrowed brow. At last he sighed and said, "I love you, John Brown, I do. You've been a true hero, and I don't want you killed. You and those brave young men with you. We may suffer losses," Father said, interrupting. "It's inevitable in war, but we will triumph over our enemies in the end. We will. I know it, Frederick. The Lord will protect us." "The Lord can't protect you from the nature of that place, Harper's Ferry. It's a steel trap, John. You'll get in and not be able to get out. Please forget this. Our hostages will shield us while we're down there, and the wilderness and the mountains will preserve us when we've left. No, 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 impossible. I know these white Southerners. You don't. These men will cut down every tree from here to Tennessee but one, and when they have caught you, they'll hang you from it, and along the way they'll butcher any slave who even dreams of rebellion in his sleep. We'll be too many, too soon for them to go against us, and we'll be everywhere across the South. So they'll never be able to unite against us in any one place. This is no conventional war I'm fomenting here, Frederick. The Federal Army, John. Remember that. Yes, and remember the Seminoles. The Alleghenies will be my Everglades. And our Negroes, are they to be your Indian warriors? If you will lead them with me, if you are at my side, they will rise up and follow me into battle against their white masters. It will be a true revolution, the revolution we should have fought back in '76. No, Brown, it won't. It'll be suicidal, worse than Nat Turner. With or without me, it's destined to fail. We are too few, too poorly armed, too ill-equipped, and too untrained as soldiers to accomplish what you have imagined. Father stepped away and stared down at the large open pit of the quarry below. In a low, sulky voice he said, I am glad you weren't around to advise our revolutionary forebears, Frederick. We'd all still be British subjects. Mr. Douglas smiled. Yes, well, given the fact that the British have outlawed slavery for close to a quarter century now, it might not be a bad thing to be a British subject. In the end, Frederick, it's right principles and simple economics that will settle this thing in our favor. Mr. Douglas, in his low, melodious, melancholy voice, answered, No, John. It's race that will settle it, and it will settle it against us. Race and simple arithmetic. Not principles and not economics. Simply put, there are more of you in this country than of us. This is not Haiti or Jamaica, and the northern United States are not a separate nation than the southern United States. It's race, John. Skin color and hair and physiognomy. You say us, and you mean all Americans willing to go to war to end slavery. But every other American who says us means race, means us, white people, or us Negroes. You are a noble, good man, but you are nearly alone in this country. Even me, when I say us, I mean we Negroes. Then you will not join me. John, I cannot. My practical judgment forbids it. My conscience forbids it. My love of my people forbids it. Mr. Douglas placed his heavy hands onto Father's narrow shoulders and looked into the old man's eyes, and I thought that both men would weep, for their eyes were full. Please, come away from this. Come back with me, John. Let your son here return to Virginia by himself, and send your men home. Fight this war on another front. This is the only front left to me. Mr. Douglas turned away and said to Shields Green, I shall return home to Rochester. If you wish, you may go back with me, or you may stay. You've heard all the arguments as well as I. Shields turned his face not to Mr. Douglas, but to Father, and he replied, I believe I'll go with the old man. Mr. Douglas nodded and slowly shook hands with us one by one, and when he had finished he embraced us each in a heartfelt way one by one, as if it were he who was going to war and not we, and then he departed from us straightway for his home in Rochester. That fateful October night at the Kennedy farmhouse, after Father and the others had departed, I spent a good while gathering and heaping everything together on the floor in front of the stove, and when I stared down at the mass of incrimination, it was like listening to 1,000 low, choked confessions all at once. I burned none of it. My heretical refusal to play Isaac to my father's Abraham seemed not mine alone. It felt emblematic to me, as if an age of heroism had acceded to an age of cowardice, as if, in the context of those last days at Harper's Ferry, and the one great moral issue of our time, I had become a man of another time, a man of the future, I suppose, a modern man. Stepping back from the cold stove, I set my candle on the table and blew it out. Then I crossed the stubbled field to the shed where Barclay Kopek and Merriam had finished loading the weapons onto the wagon. Kopek was seated up on the box with the reins in his hands, scowling impatiently at me, while Miriam sat ashen-faced behind him. "You finally done in there?" Kopek said. "Yes." "Well, then, let's get a move on. The old man must already be across the bridge. Me and Frank heard gunfire a minute ago." "Fine," I said, and climbed onto the wagon, and we headed gradually downhill towards the abandoned schoolhouse overlooking the river and the town. We could hear guns firing below intermittently and from several different places. We quickly unloaded the weapons and stacked the cases along the walls inside the schoolhouse. Suddenly, Merriam blurted in his nervous, high-pitched voice, "Owen, where are the slaves? There should be hundreds of escaped slaves coming to us by now, right? Isn't that right, Owen? We got all these damn pikes and guns and no one to give them to." He laughed edgily. "Well, shut up, Frank," Kopek said. "They'll come in, and it's all right if they don't, or if only a few make it here tonight. They'll catch up with us later in the mountains. We will arm them then." "No, Barclay," I said, "they won't." "Well, how's that?" "They're not coming. Not now, not ever." "Well, now, come on, Owen. What are you talking about?" Merriam demanded, his voice rising. "We got options, plenty of them." "Boys, Frederick Douglass is in Rochester, New York tonight, asleep in his bed. I know that, and Shields Green knows it, and Father knows it. We lied to you," I said. I revealed what had happened in Chambersburg and how later Father had insisted that once Mr. Douglass realized we were deadly serious, he would change his mind. In the end, Mr. Douglass would fly to our side, Father was sure of it, and Shields had agreed in a way that made it seem that his friend Mr. Douglass had given him some private assurances. Father instructed us not to report to the other men what had been said at the quarry. "It will only make them unnecessarily fearful and will sow disunity amongst them," he said, and we obeyed. Shields because he believed that my father knew things that no other man knew, and I because I was his son. "Shields thinks Osawatomie Brown is a prophet," I said. "And I take it you don't," Kopek said, disgusted. "No." "Owen Brown, what kind of man are you?" Kopek said, and turned away from me. We heard more gunshots then, rifle shots coming from the vicinity of the church a short ways above the armory and overlooking it. Some townspeople were running and ducking behind walls, taking pot shots at our men in the armory yard below. Miriam was frantic by now, while Kopek stared coldly from the cliff to the town. "You should have kept them from going in," he said finally. "You should have told us the truth." "That wouldn't have kept Father out. Nothing would. He'd have gone alone if necessary. You know that. No, it's better that they all went in together, not just 5 or 6 of them. Even me, if Father had not posted me on this side of the river, I'd have gone in too. 20 men have a better chance of getting out than 5 or 6. And maybe, but only if they leave that place now, Kopek replied, and then he declared that he was going over. He would tell them the truth of the matter himself. To let them know the real situation, he said. He called Miriam to him, calmed him somewhat, and asked him to go down into the town with him. Miriam agreed at once. It's how I knew it would happen, he said. I foresaw it, and now it's the Lord's will running things, not mine. It's how it has to be, so I must go with you, Barclay. What about you, Owen? Father said to wait here for the Negroes. You two ought to do the same. He ordered us to arm the slaves when they came here and to meet up with him and the others later in Cumberland. Well, now that's done with, isn't it? Countermand the order, for heaven's sakes. You got that right. You're in command up here. My father does not want me to save him, I said. Well, seems to me that's the only order you're following. Back at the house there, when we loaded the wagon, I never smelled chimney smoke. You didn't burn those papers like he said to, did you, Owen? I'll go back and destroy them later, or carry them away. So, Owen Brown, it's over, and you've single-handedly done the whole thing in. Amazing. Kopek shook his head in weary resignation. Well, what about it? Are you coming with me and Frank? No. Well, you don't intend to try stopping us, do you? He said, and he leveled his rifle at me. My orders are to stand fast unless he sends for us, and if you go down there with what I've told you, Barclay, all you'll do is sow disunity amongst the men, I said. Father was right about that much. One by one they'll sneak off and run, and not a one will come out of that place alive unless every one of them believes he's fighting for more than just to save his own life. Those are brave men, Barclay, and they still have a chance, but this news will make cowards of them all. You sound like the old man, all theory. You ready, Frank? Miriam nodded solemnly, and they slowly backed away from me, with Kopek still keeping me under his gun, although I had no intentions of trying to force them to stay. It was too late. They were already doing exactly what I feared the others would do, cutting away from Father and running for their lives. For a long while I did not move. I was alone as I had ever been in my life. But strangely, all unexpectedly, free. After a lifetime bound to my father's fierce will and companionship by heavy steel manacles and chains, I had watched them come suddenly unlocked, and I had simply, almost casually, pitched them aside. But were my actions from then on those of a free man? I cannot say. To be sure, I followed no impulses but my own. When Kopek and Miriam had been gone a while, I climbed the tallest oak tree up there on the cliff, and with my Sharps rifle in my lap, made a sort of crow's nest from which I could see clearly Harper's Ferry. From the rifle factory at the southern end of town, where Kagi, Leary, and Copeland were pinned down by local riflemen, to the Maryland side of the B&O Bridge, where Oliver, Will Thompson, and Dangerfield Newby were posted. All was still and silent down there, until I saw Father walk out of the firehouse with a man I did not recognize, and appear to send him from the armory across the open square to the hotel. After a time, the man returned, carrying a large carton of what must have been food, breakfast for the hostages and the raiders both, I assumed. Again, all was calm for a while, until around mid-morning, when movement and the sound of men and horses below me and to my right drew my attention. A large party of armed white civilians under the flag of the notorious Jefferson Guards was riding in from the west. Close to the Maryland end of the bridge, they spotted Oliver and Will Thompson and Dangerfield Newby, dismounted and began firing at them. The three raiders took shelter behind the toll house and returned fire, but the fusillade from the militiamen drove them steadily backwards towards the bridge, where I saw Newby suddenly fall down dead, slain by what appeared to be a long spike or a bolt shot from a smooth-bore musket that tore through him ear to ear at the throat. Soon after this, another detachment of armed civilians led by a man in uniform came riding into town from the southwest along Shenandoah Street, where they swiftly secured the Shenandoah Bridge and took up positions behind the arsenal. Their position, combined with the Jefferson Guards at the B&O Bridge, effectively shut off the only escape routes left to Father and his men. In about an hour, a pair of men, one of whom I did not know and figured was a hostage, the other, Will Thompson, my brother-in-law, emerged from the firehouse bearing a white flag, the signal to parley. There was by now an emboldened crowd of armed townspeople in the square and on the porch of the hotel and the platform of the railroad station, and when they saw the two men come forward from the firehouse, the crowd rushed them and seized and beat Will, dragging him into the hotel. A few moments later, my brother Watson and Aaron Stevens and a third man, another hostage, came out of the firehouse and walked into the cobbled square with a white flag. Suddenly there was a barrage of gunfire from the crowd, and Watson and Stevens fell. The hostage ran towards the crowd, but Watson pulled himself to his knees and dragged his gut-shot body back to the firehouse. Stevens lay writhing in pain, shot 4 or more times and unable to lift himself from the pavement when one of the hostages came out of the firehouse, picked him up, and lugged him across the square and into the hotel. More time passed, while the crowd at the hotel and railroad station and in the town square grew larger by the minute, and more courageous and raucous with drink and rage. By midday, the youngest of the raiders, Will Lehman, was dead, and the oldest, Dangerfield Newby. My brother Watson and Aaron Stevens lay wounded, perhaps mortally, and Will Thompson, brutally beaten, sat in the hotel under armed guard. I was sure that Copic and Miriam had by now fled into the woods, and there may well have been others among the raiders who, to save themselves, had abandoned Father. At one point I noticed a fellow walking exposed on the railroad loading trestle that bordered the armory buildings, and when he neared the firehouse he dropped to one knee and peered around the water tower. He did not appear to be armed. Even so, when the door to the firehouse opened and I saw Edwin Copic and my brother Oliver standing there, I feared that the man would shoot them, for they were exposed and unsuspecting. But no, Copic spotted the fellow, raised his rifle, and fired, dropping him like a stone, at which point a second man who had been following a few yards behind the first shot straight down into the engine room and caught Oliver full bore in the chest, knocking him backwards inside. Copic's having killed an apparently unarmed man seemed to fuel the crowd's drunken rage. In minutes they were dragging Will Thompson from the hotel, pummeling and screaming wildly at him. They set him out on the edge of the bridge, stepped away, and shot him many times, after which they tossed his body into the river, where the current carried it against a thicket of driftwood. About mid-afternoon I noticed a significant number of gun-toting townsmen separate themselves from the mob and in an organized way move up Shenandoah Street in the direction of the rifle works, where it appeared that Kagi, Leary, and Copeland were still successfully holding off the militia, thanks to the deep, fast-running 20-foot-wide channel. A footbridge led from the shore to the island, but the walls of the factory came right to the water's edge, as if to a moat, and up to now the militiamen had been hesitant about rushing it and had contented themselves with keeping the 3 raiders under siege. Now, encouraged by the crowd of heavily armed townsmen, they put up a protective shield of steady gunfire at the factory windows, whilst a gang of men ran against the timbered gate with a battering ram and smashed it in. Then the entire combined force of the militiamen and townspeople charged into the factory. From my treetop eyrie high above the further shore, I watched Kagi and 2 Negro men, Leary and Copeland, climb out one of the large windows that faced the river. The 3 men hung from the sill above the churning water for a second and then dropped. In seconds, 50 riflemen were firing at them from the upper-story windows, killing John Kagi, who sank beneath the water almost at once, and hitting Leary numerous times, but not killing him outright, for he managed to struggle back to shore downstream a ways, where a contingent of militiamen pulled him limp and bleeding up the embankment into custody. Copeland made it to a large flat rock in mid-river, where he was immediately spotted by some Jefferson guards posted on the further shore, who began shooting at him. Caught hopelessly in a crossfire, he raised his hands in the air, and a few minutes later a pair of fellows rowed out and made him their prisoner. There was a lull until about 3 p.m., when a B&O train pulled in from the west and stopped on a siding at the upper end of the armory, a safe distance from the firehouse. Several dozen civilian riflemen stepped down from the passenger cars and quickly arranged themselves in assault formation and began marching on the firehouse from the rear. They had scaling ladders and got over the fence back there with ease and were halfway across the armory grounds before Father and the boys spotted them and began firing out the windows and the partly open door of the firehouse. The raid might have ended there and then, but neither of the other 2 militia companies in town thought to charge the undefended front gate and storm the firehouse. Consequently, in about 10 minutes, despite taking some serious casualties, Father and his remaining men managed to drive the first company back out of the armory grounds and over the fence. Towards dusk, and starting around 4 p.m., more men rode into town, uniformed soldiers and officers this time, hundreds of angry, frightened, armed white Southerners coming in on horseback and by train and on foot, until the town square and many of the main streets were filled with Federal soldiers, top-hatted riflemen and sharpshooters in buckskins, excitable boys with pistols, vagrants and drunkards, men and women, too, carousing and firing their guns into the air and scuffling amongst themselves, and the occasional mounted U.S. Army officer waving his saber and trying vainly to restore order. It had grown suddenly cold, but there was still plenty of daylight up on the rocky escarpment where I remained clinging to the topmost branches of the highest oak tree. Down in the gorge, however, the town was falling into darkness. It had grown nearly impossible to make out what I had climbed up into the tree to view, and could not bring myself these many hours later to leave, despite the horror of it. My brothers and friends making their last stand against slavery, and of course my father, Father Abraham, making his terrible final sacrifice to his God. An excited waiting had begun down there, a tense, almost hysterical pause as before the public execution of a famous criminal. I shifted my position, and at that instant from the darkness below heard a rifle shot ring out, and a bullet tore through the leaves close beside my cheek. Then a second gun barked, a muzzle loader. I heard the ball crack against a branch a few feet above me, and a flurry of yellow leaves fluttered across my head and floated to the ground. I was awash in the last remaining light of day up here, and the soldiers and townspeople below, standing in darkness, had finally seen me. A third shot went wide of the mark, but I heard it tick through the leaves of a nearby tree. I let go of my rifle and heard it clatter to the ground and felt my way to the next lower branch. A whole crowd of shooters was firing at me now. With my left arm, I clamped myself to a slender branch close to my head and reached down with my right hand to grasp a sturdier limb below. I let my weight go and groped in the air for a footing, and for a few seconds my body was suspended entirely on my poor arm. That childhood curse. Never had it so enraged and humiliated me. Suddenly there was an extended barrage of gunfire all around me, and I thought, surely now I am a dead man, when the limb I clung to with my hooked arm let go. Shot through, it floated away from the tree still clamped in the crook of my arm, and I fell. A long, clattering drop into the darkness and safety and silence of the forest. Father believed that the universe was a gigantic clockworks, brilliantly lit, but it's not. It's an endless sea of darkness moving beneath a dark sky, between which isolate bits of light we constantly rise and fall. We pass between sea and sky with unaccountable, humiliating ease, as if there were no firmament between the firmaments, no above or below, here or there, now or then, with only the feeble conventions of language, our contrived principles, and our love of one another's light to keep our own light from going out. Abandon any one of them, and we dissolve in darkness like salt in water. For most of my life, surely since that day in October when I fled Harper's Ferry, I have been a steadily diminishing light, until the day when I began to set down this long account, and my light flared up as it never had before. But soon I will learn if this has been all for naught, if this passage between the firmaments has been no more than the dying fall of a cinder into the dark waters of the swirling deep. When I have told the little that is left to tell, I will simply put down my pencil and pick up my revolver, and I will use it to place me at my father's side, where I have always properly belonged. If I cannot lie there next to him, and my ghost cannot reside alongside his, then it will mean only that my light went out forever on that night those many long years ago at Harper's Ferry, and this account has been but a meaningless, phosphorescent flare, the memory of light instead of the thing itself, and it will not matter. Here is all that I have left to tell. I returned to the Kennedy farm. I pulled the wagon in behind the house out of sight from the road and went to the storage shed where in the darkness I groped over the half-dozen wooden crates that Father and the boys had emptied. I found one that was intact and had its topside boards. It had contained the long pikes that Father had imagined would terrorize the slaveholders. I carried it to the kitchen and commenced filling it from the heap of papers and books that lay on the floor where I had placed them the night before. While I was in the midst of this task, I heard a group of horsemen approach from the direction of Harper's Ferry and stop before the house. "Hello, the house!" one of them shouted. "Anyone there?" I quickly placed the lid onto the half-filled case. Then I lifted it and carried it out the rear door of the kitchen, where silently, carefully, as if it were a child's coffin, I set it in the wagon bed. I climbed up on the driver's box and sat there, waiting. For several minutes all was quiet. Then I heard the clump of boots on the porch of the front house, and someone rapped on the door. "It appears there ain't anyone home, Captain," he called back. "And no matter," came the response. "We got most of what we come for back at the schoolhouse anyhow." A moment later I heard them leave. I sat motionless for a long while until the horse abruptly shifted her weight, signaling me to give her direction. But I had no plan. I barely had thoughts. I had spent my entire life following Father's plans, thinking his thoughts, and at that moment I did not know what to do or think. I was in considerable physical pain, for I had cut and bruised myself badly in my fall, and my clothes were torn. I was lightly armed. I had my revolver, but no rifle, and I had no food or supplies or money. But I was alone and free. The entire continent lay out there. I was a man, a white man, and I could go to any place on it where no one knew me, and I could become new. I could become an American without a history and with no story to tell. So if I had a plan, that was it. If I had a thought, that was the thought. I clucked to Adelphi and turned her left away from Harper's Ferry, westward. Before me, the narrow country road ran towards the forest, and I remember as the wheels clattered over the rough road the sound of the long pine case thumping heavily against the wagon bed behind me. The sky had cleared, and a belt of stars shone directly overhead, and a bright quarter moon had risen in the east. The trees were blue-black and flattened in the moonlight, and the fields seemed to be covered with a skin of powdery snow.